Thank you, Holly. Thank you for setting this up. You and the World Jewry Committee. This is a great chance for us to share some intimate story time with Sarah Tuttle-Singer, who I have known from afar at many meetings where I've gotten to see her speak and Facebook. And one of, I think, the great storytellers, one of the people who can really connect us to Israel as well as anyone. So Sarah, thank you for being with us. And it's great to have this opportunity.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you. First of all, can everyone hear me? Am I loud enough?
Perfect.
Great. Okay, terrific. We're still in Israel, even though lockdown has begun to open up. Many of us are still staying home on the safe side. So I'm at home and the internet connection is shaky at best. But the beauty of where we live is we're right on the edge of the moshav, or the village, and there's fields and orchards, but there's also no internet. So we'll do our best. Rabbi, thank you for having me. And Holly, it's wonderful to see you here. I'm lucky to know you in multiple locations. We've seen each other in Jaffa. We got to experience a beautiful day together when you were on a trip. And then we also were together in Los Angeles. And so you are a connector between two of my favorite places in the world. And I'm thrilled to be here to talk more about life in Israel and also about my third favorite place, which is really the seat of my heart and the love of my life, Jerusalem. And I'm very, very honored to be here and to see so many familiar names, including I see Gail's on, and it's just, I feel very lucky to be here today to share some stories. So I thought, with your permission, I would actually read the introduction to my book as a way of kicking off and talking about some of the complexities around Jerusalem. Is that okay?
It's great. Let me say two things. One, I just went through and I muted all of you. Please do not be offended. It's just easier for us to hear if only the people who are speaking have their microphones on. We will have an opportunity towards the end, around 10:45, 10:50, to take questions or thoughts or share thoughts. So you can either wait till then, or you can write your questions in the chat, and Holly will sort of curate them for us for towards the end of the talk. The second thing I just want to make sure people know, this is the book that Sarah is about to read from. It's called Jerusalem Drawn and Quartered. It is a real accomplishment, an exploration of the old city of Jerusalem like none that I had seen previously, and that's saying something. It's hard to have an original book about a 3,000-year-old city, but it's beautiful, it's intense, and it's wonderful to hear. So Sarah, we would love for you to share some of it with us.
Thank you. Now I'm going to try to share screen so I can share some photos at the same time. So may I do that now and then I'll unshare? Okay. All right. This is a first. This is a Shechianu moment for me. Okay, advanced. Aha. All right. There's a street in Jerusalem that has two names, Al-Wad in Arabic and Haggai in Hebrew, and it's my favorite street. It runs from the north end of the old city to the south and back again. It's the street that leads you from Damascus Gate to the Western Wall, the holiest site where Jews are allowed to pray. It's also the street where a quick turn and a step or two takes you down a little road to one of the Aqsa Gates, one of Islam's holiest sites, and a spiritual and political flashpoint between Jews and Muslims. The Cardo ran underneath back in the day. The street smells like coffee and ripe strawberries and saffron. You can buy bags of pink and blue almonds and Christmas lights during Ramadan to illuminate the night. There's a guy who runs a money changing station. His voice box was removed a few years ago, but he'll press on his windpipe and sing something by Fairuz. There's also a yeshiva heavily guarded by guys in pants and black shirts with black yarmulkes on their heads and black guns on their hips. The kids are escorted to and from the Western Wall by at least one armed guard, sometimes more depending on how many kids and what's happening in the news cycle. The mothers push pink strollers quickly from the front. They don't stop. Even if their baby is crying, they keep walking fast, their eyes moving left and right until they reach the Jewish quarter. And then they stop and breathe and buy a coffee for 6 shekels at Kofix. Late at night, you can hear the guys in the yeshiva singing. During the day, you can hear Palestinian hip hop or Kulthum. 5 times a day, you can hear the call to prayer. On Friday afternoons, there's the Shabbat siren. There are these old women from the villages outside Jerusalem who bring fig leaves during summer, artichokes in winter, and they sit on the street on woven rugs and sell their reapings. They look old, but they probably aren't. Then there are the dudes who sit around and play backgammon, their bodies smushed into metal chairs. They are the masters of their own fate, the kings of the street, until, that is, their wives call them home. There are a lot of kids, Jewish and Arab. They're the same ages and they play the same games, but I've never seen them play together. And then there are the border police who are stationed at the major intersections, and mostly they point their guns down until they don't. I've seen them buy coffee from the old guy who sells juice and popsicles and have their drinks one day and then interrogate and frisk his son the next. This is the street where there's an indentation in one of the walls that some believe was left by Jesus himself when he stumbled and almost fell on his way to being crucified. Although maybe the indentation is there merely because so many thousands, maybe millions, believe that that was the spot. And so day by day, year by year, we've helped make that indentation by placing our own faithful hands against the stone. I've done it, and the stone feels warm. But the part that makes me real, the part that is hardest to understand and bends my knees in humble supplication is the intersection between Guy Street and Alwad and Via della Rosa, especially on Friday afternoons, and especially when the sun softens the stones and makes the street shine like seashells on fair skin. It's where you see it all. The Christian pilgrims carrying the cross up from Lion's Gate, wafting past the shops, stopping at each station, singing, praying, sorrow by sorrow, on their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Muslim guys heading towards Aqsa with their prayer rugs, the young women in hijab and the moms pushing babies, buying candy or going to pray. The yeshiva boys heading to the Western Wall for Shabbat, and whole families, beautiful families, with 6 or 7 kids, all dressed in their finest, their faces scrubbed and their hair shining, going to pray too. Or maybe going for a meal, or just walking together during the holiest time in the holiest place. But it's also around the corner from where my friend got beaten by the border police when he was 19 because his papers had expired the week before, where a soldier the exact same age kicked him in the head over and over until his face was a strawberry pulp. But when my friend looked up, that soldier was the one crying. And this place is also around the corner from the spot where 2 Jewish fathers were stabbed to death by a terrorist, where they bled out on the stone street, where their injured and screaming and terrified wives were kicked and spat on by the shopkeepers. And it's just down the street from where I stood one night when I was 18, covered in my own blood. But it's also the street where I carried a gray kitten with a moth's wings fur, like my cat's, that I had back home, where I took him to a woman in the Jewish quarter who was caring for him to this day. And it's the street where the border police and the yeshiva kids and the Palestinian merchants and even a random priest have asked me separately and on different days, how's the kitten? It's the street that flows from 2 different directions, where we drink coffee, where we kiss, where I looked for my mother's ghost years after her death, where I imagined my great-grandmother walking with her hair blown back like seaweed, her head held high. It's my favorite street because in the injured artery from Jerusalem's Holy Heart to the rest of us. And there on that street, terrible things have happened, but lovely and beautiful things have happened too. And it's the street I walk the most because if you expect to find a miracle in Jerusalem, you have to start looking in a place like this, where all roads meet, the beautiful and the terrible.
Beautiful, thank you.
And I think that story sums up so many of the complexities of the old city, and the book gets into more of those stories in greater detail. And later on in this conversation, I want to share the story about the cat that I alluded to in the introduction, because that's one of my favorite stories from Jerusalem, bar none. So we can get to that too.
Absolutely. What I love about the introduction, among other things, is it just, you know, we talk about Jerusalem as this tapestry of life, and you capture that so powerfully in those passages. One of the things that comes through, even in the introduction, and certainly as the book goes on, and anyone who's ever been in Jerusalem on anything other than a well-curated tour bus, knows that Jerusalem is a very tense place and it's a very intense place. And there's a lot of people anxious about a lot of different things all the time. Although that anxiety level, ebbs and flows depending on what's in the news. However, over the last 3 months, the news has been different, and the whole country had a huge scare, massive anxiety about a common enemy, about this virus. And I'm curious, over these last 3 months, or we're hoping you could share with us over these last 3 months, some stories about the impact on different communities or across communities. What's been going on in Israel when everyone was suddenly stuck at home, all afraid of the same very tiny little enemy.
Well, thank you for mentioning all of that. It's been a very trying time here in Israel. On most days, Israelis don't like being told what to do. And suddenly, early on, before the rest of the world, at least the rest of the United States, had wrapped its arms around the dangers of COVID-19, Israel was beginning to shut down. Our airports, we had issued a travel warning asking people not to fly. We were starting to encourage folks to socially distance. Our prime minister refused to shake hands. This was shortly before the election. So in the backdrop of this, at the beginning of COVID-19, the prime minister was running for re-election against Benny Gantz and various other political players. So that was happening at the same time, along with all the other different political intricacies of living in a very nuanced and often complicated and oftentimes tough area of the world. So all of that was happening. And Israel began to shut down. We began to issue the shelter at home orders very early on. And as I said before, Israelis hate being told what to do. If those of you who've ever been to Israel and you've ever stood in line, you know that there's no such thing as a line in Israel, right? And it's more like the wildebeest scene in The Lion King, where you've got pushing and shoving and shouting and jostling and snarling. And there's only one person in Israel who actually will believe in that line, and that's the person who's at the front of the line. And they will guard that line like it's the border with Lebanon. But for everyone else, it's absolute chaos in the back. And I actually got to be that one person who was once at the front of the line in Israel. And it was Friday afternoon. I was getting ready to get on the last bus out of Jerusalem back to Ramla so I could get to my moshav. And it was a hot day. This is before COVID-19. So there was no such thing as social distancing, and no one had ever, it was nowhere on the horizon. And I'm standing there, front of the line, getting ready to get on the bus. And behind me, there's a woman in hijab, in the Muslim headdress, and she's carrying a bag full of challah, of the braided bread for Shabbat. And there's soldiers, and there's this young woman who's covered in tattoos, and there's this religious family, and the whole, all of Israel's different groups seem to be behind me in this line. But I'm at the front of it, and I'm standing there. I'm about 5'3" on a good day. I'm actually shorter, but I like to give myself a few extra inches. And I'm standing there with my arms out like this, prepared to fight. And there's the jostling and the churning, and suddenly the crowd begins to swell like the sea. And there's a man who's pushing through the crowd, and he's bumping everyone out of the way. And I turn and I face him, all 5'3" inches of me, and I say to him, "Sir, you shall not pass. How dare you try to get in front of me in line?" And he says, "Move, I'm going on." I said, "No, you can't." And the Muslim woman behind me taps my arm, and she says, "Habibti, sweetie, that's the bus driver. You should let him on." So I step back, I let him on. I apologized, wished him Shabbat Shalom. He wished me Shabbat Shalom. We all laughed, and we made our way. I'm sharing that story to give you a sense of the culture in Israel. We are a country that really doesn't like to be told what to do in any way, shape, or form. But when these lockdown orders were issued, and when the prime minister really took it seriously and made us realize the importance of watching out for one another, we all did. There's an expression in Israel, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lezeh, expression in Judaism. All of Israel is responsible for one another. And that really seemed to sink in with us. And not just within the Jewish community, too. It was also very prevalent in the Muslim and Christian Arab communities, and in the different communities throughout Israel, and people took it seriously. And we followed the instructions. And there was some pushback from the ultra-Orthodox community, but it later became clear that it wasn't really on purpose. They just didn't know that there were these orders in place. And that's something that actually COVID-19 really showed us in Israel, is that we have these deep divisions that during this time where we're really trying to come together and be cohesive and take care of one another and ourselves by being at home, there are still these rifts in society that make it harder for us to stay safe unless we find better ways of communicating with each other. So one of the beautiful things to continue to come out of COVID-19 here in Israel is this understanding that our communities have to talk to each other in a better, more meaningful way. The secular community needs to be in touch with the Haredi community. Jewish community needs to be in touch with the Arab community, that we all need to find ways to unite the tribes of Israel. Ruby Rivlin describes the tribes of Israel as being secular, the religious nationalist Jews, the Haredi Jews, and the Arabs, and also the greater diaspora. These are the different tribes of Israel, and we have to find ways to communicate better, and that became very clear in COVID-19, although we actually, I think, did a pretty fair job of doing that. As lockdown restrictions begin to ease, we are seeing a new, I wouldn't call it a new wave of the virus, but we're seeing more cases arise with the virus. And so I have some concerns about what that will mean, but hopefully we'll remember what it was like to turn within, how we did protect one another, how we found ways to show solidarity, like coming out on our balconies and applauding the healthcare workers at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, and during Memorial Day, when we should be out barbecuing and celebrating in the streets. I'm sorry, Independence Day, when we should be out celebrating in the streets. Following Israel's Memorial Day, we were still able to salute the pilots as they flew over, and that salute was actually also for the healthcare workers. So that was also something very special and very meaningful. And speaking of our healthcare workers, one of the intricacies that came out during COVID-19 was this awareness that the folks who were behind the masks in the hospital and behind all the protective gear and who were saving the lives and of Israelis throughout the country, regardless of religion and gender and background, were many times were actually Arab. And so this helped create a paradigm shift for many Israelis, not for everyone, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be a big enough paradigm shift that we need. But it was very moving to realize just how interconnected our faiths truly are, that the health of the Muslim community, the health of the Christian community, and the health of the Jewish community all depend on one another, and that we are on our different boats riding the storm, but we are sharing the storm and have to find ways of taking care of one another. And so that was one of the more poignant things to emerge during this crisis here in Israel. I know that the United States is grappling still with a staggering death toll, and I also know that with all the protests sweeping across the country, there's got to be some concern that some of the social distance measures are not in place, and there may be a new rise in viruses. And so you're all in my thoughts right now as you continue to go through that.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. It's how the news comes here. You mentioned in what you were telling us that the Haredim had not continued with their minyanim, thumbing their nose at the authorities, but just didn't have the story.
Right.
Of course, that's not how it's framed in the Jewish press here. We all heard about them still having their, minyanim and how bad it was. So thank you for that insight and perspective. Even I had not actually heard that follow-up, that it was more a communication issue than
There was a very small subset that did it dafka on purpose. But for the most part, overwhelmingly, the mayor of Bnei Barak came out and said, we just didn't know, please don't discriminate against us, we'll do better. And then you can see that everyone's wearing masks. And in fact, the virus cases that we're seeing now are not coming from the ultra-Orthodox communities. They're actually coming from schools, from regular families, religious, secular, Arab, Jewish, all across Israel, because the schools opened up too quickly. No, I actually, there's a quick story I want to share about going through this crisis. May I share it about COVID-19? It's not about the ultra-Orthodox, but it's—
Yeah, no, of course.
Okay, great. So my partner and I were at Terem. Terem is the urgent care facility that's throughout Israel. And they're very special places. There's one in Modi'in, there's two in Jerusalem, there's some in Bnei Brak, and all around the country. And the doctor, the CEO, the original CEO of Terem, was tragically murdered in a terror attack the day before his daughter's wedding, David Appelbaum, and a blessed memory. And his memory is served in many ways by the good that Terem continues to do for the entire country. And so many of the doctors are Jewish, but overwhelmingly most of the doctors at Terem are Arab, as well as the nurses and other healthcare support staff. But the last place you want to be during a pandemic in Israel is Terem, is urgent care, because you don't want to be around sick people, right? You're trying to socially distance yourself and stay at home, but sometimes you actually have to go to the doctor or to an urgent care facility. And so my partner and I were at Terem. It was a Friday night. We were hopeful that there would be fewer people out in the waiting room, and sure enough, there weren't that many people out, because we weren't the only ones who didn't want to be at Terem in the middle of this pandemic. But then these three guys come in, and they're all limping, and they're all without shirts, and they're wearing shorts, and it looks like they may have been in some kind of sports accident together. One of them's actually carrying a soccer ball under his arm as he's limping. And none of them are wearing masks. Now, I'm going to, full disclosure, I am a lunatic when it comes to the mask thing. I'm surprised I'm actually not wearing a mask right now. The only reason I'm not wearing it is so that I can talk to you. It's hard to speak through a mask. But I'm one of these people who will glare at people who aren't wearing masks, and even remonstrate with folks. So these three young men come in. None of them are wearing masks. And my partner and I are looking at each other, and I say to him, "They're not wearing masks." He says, "I know, why aren't they wearing masks?" And he says something to them. He says, "Why aren't you guys wearing masks?" And they said, "Well, we don't have any masks. We don't need to wear masks." And they broaden their shoulders and, push out their chests. My partner does the same, and he says, "Well, you're supposed to wear a mask. It's the law." And it looks like it's about to be a standoff. Have you seen the movie West Side Story, or the play West Side Story? When the Jets and the Sharks are about to rumble, it was like that. There's this real tension in the air. And then finally, my partner relents, and he says, "Well, we actually have some masks in the car if you want some." And the guys back down, and they say, "Yeah, actually, we would really love it. We got to take care of our safta after all." And so we go out to the car and we bring them masks, and they put them on, and it was very nice. And then we wished each other well and said, "May you be healthy." But that story and that experience was so, in many ways, so representative of the time, that there is this tension, there is this fear, but we look for ways to help each other and come together and do the right thing. And I'm sorry we had to be at Terem in the first place, but I'm glad that we at least had some kind of positive experience out of it.
That's great. It's funny. There are plenty of similar stories playing out here, both about the urgent cares as well as, with the people who are trying to enforce, orders on masks, whether or not they're imbued with that authority. So that's great. Sarah, I wonder if you would tell us, either from after COVID or before, one of the things that you're researching your book gave you is a perspective on people, on all the people in Israel that many of us don't get. I lived in Israel for 2 years, had been there many, many times. It wasn't until a trip I had mentioned to you a couple of years ago that I had spent really any time in an Arab village, or even in some big cities like Nazareth, because the trips that I took with my Jewish organizations just didn't go there, as well as various churches and whatnot, and interacting with Arabs in East Jerusalem and whatnot. Most of us have never had those experiences. And because of that, I think, as your book very rightly points out, we are missing a whole layers of what's going on in Israel, and often very beautiful layers. can you tell us a couple of stories or a couple of thoughts of things you wish that we knew, or populations and what's going on in them that you think would be worth our while to know more about?
I love this question. The first thing is, I wish that COVID-19 will end as soon as possible so that you can all come to Jerusalem and I can take you to actually meet some of the people that I got to meet and that I wrote about in the book, and we'll share some of their stories with you now. Overwhelmingly, it's so important that we actually have interaction with each other. I'm going to back up a little and say that the reason I fell in love with the old city actually is multi-layered. I came on a summer program when I was 16. My mother promised me that I would love the sights and the smells and the texture and the sounds of the old city, and she described the sound of the church bells and the smell of the za'atar, and how she went back in 1967, and it had come shortly after the 6-Day War, and had watched a camel walk through Damascus Gate. And she painted this picture for me that was very romantic and very evocative. And I was intrigued, but I was also a teenager and just wanted to spend my summer at the mall in Los Angeles. But my mother made me go to Israel, and she sent me on the summer program. And turns out that she was right. I fell in love with Jerusalem. I fell in love with the old city while I was standing on a rooftop looking out over this mosaic of different faiths and different people. And it struck me, it resonated so much through me that the whole of Jerusalem was greater than the sum of its parts. But the thing is, a few years later, when I was staying in the old city, I was standing by Damascus Gate in the moonlight. It was this beautiful sultry night in August, and I'm looking at Damascus Gate, which looks like something out of a medieval fairy tale. And then suddenly I realized that there was searing pain in the back of my head and in my neck and in my shoulder. And I reached back and I touched myself, and I realized that I was bleeding, that someone or someone's were throwing stones at me. To this day, I have no idea why. All I knew was that I was barely 18 years old, still in high school, standing there alone, feeling vulnerable, feeling afraid. I ran headlong through Damascus Gate into the Muslim quarter. And all around me was this language that I didn't know. There was the sound of fireworks. There was smoke in the air. There was graffiti written in red that looked like blood. I was terrified, out of my mind. And I found 2 border police officers who took me out of Damascus Gate, escorted me up to Jaffa Road, and I sat there and I cried, and I promised myself that that was it. I was never going back in the old city again. Well, life has a way of taking you on interesting journeys. And 15 years later, I was living in Israel, working for the Times of Israel, the online newspaper based out of Jerusalem, with a journalist named Avi Issacharov. And Avi is one of the co-creators of the hit TV series Fauda. He is brilliant. He is fluent in Hebrew, English, Arabic. He is a kind person, a person who understands nuance. He also smells amazing, but that's neither here nor there.
And is super handsome, I have to say.
Very handsome, very knowledgeable. And he invited me to go with him to interview one of the sheikhs on the Waqf, on the Temple Mount. And the Waqf is the Islamic authority that runs the Temple Mount since, I believe, 1967, since the 6-Day War. And I was afraid to go because it would mean going in the old city. But I assumed we'd go in through the Western Wall entrance through heavy security up to the Temple Mount. I'd spend the day with Avi, take photos like he asked, and then we'd leave. But instead, he parked by Damascus Gate. And he didn't know my backstory. He didn't know the fear, how my stomach was falling to my knees while I got out of the car. But I followed him. I decided to trust him, and step by step, breath after breath, I walked through Damascus Gate as I had that terrible summer night. And I followed him into the old city. And as we walked, as I felt my heartbeat slow, I began to look around. And I was looking for danger, for something terrible to happen, for someone to hiss at me or throw something at me or stab me. But none of that happened. Instead, I just saw people. I saw those guys playing backgammon that I described in the opening chapter. I saw moms carrying their babies. I saw pretty girls in hijab flirting with the guys behind the counter. I just saw people. And that was the beginning for me of wanting to dive deeper into the old city and find out these stories so that I would have a more nuanced perspective, like that perspective I had on that roof on my first summer in Israel, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that began the day that I walked by the Knafic place for the 100th time, because I was making these rounds through the old city over and over again. In Hebrew, it's called maslul. It's like a route or a track that you make. And I wanted to walk a way that I still felt was safe, that I knew. And at this point, I was walking by myself. And the guy who runs the Knafic place, Jafar Knafe, which is just inside Damascus Gate and kind of off to the right, he came out of his store and he said, okay, lady, you got to tell me, what's your deal? Are you a spy? Are you bored? You're here all the time. Come talk to me. And so once again, I felt my stomach drop to my knees, because I had gotten more familiar with the rhythms of the old city. I knew which way to walk in public spheres, and I was taking pictures and buying my coffee, but I had never actually sat across the table from a Palestinian. And this would be the first time that I would be sitting there across the table from a Palestinian, where I didn't know what he was going to ask me. I didn't know what he was going to say or how I would respond. And I was nervous. I thought, what if he hurts my feelings? What if I hurt his feelings? I'm a Zionist. He's not a Zionist. I'm Jewish. He's Muslim. But I went in anyway, and I prepared myself. I braced myself to talk about the conflict, capital T, capital C, the conflict. But we didn't talk about any of that. We talked about his wife's rosemary garden. We talked about how his son plays soccer, and how my son loves Queen and wants to be, the next Freddie Mercury. My daughter likes to draw. We talked about that. And we talked about the things that make us who we are, the things that make us inherently human and unique, and yet so similar. And that conversation didn't change the world, but it led to a second conversation, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth. And that became the basis for a friendship where we have begun over the years to talk about the more complicated issues, about politics, about religion, about things that make us uncomfortable, about terrorism, about occupation, about ways that we cannot live together, and ways that we must transcend and live together. And so that's what's tragic about COVID-19, among so many other things: the destruction of the economy, the loss of life, the fear that we're living with, is the fact that we don't have the same ability to flow through these different communities in person and have these conversations in person. Thank God for Zoom. I mean, we're doing it right now like this online. And one day we will be able to return to normal, having turned within, learned more about ourselves, learned more about our priorities and what's important, so that when we are able to meet in the public streets, maybe it'll be even better and more fulfilling. But that man is one of many, and he introduced me to so many more people, including this other guy who runs a hotel in the old city. It's one of the hotels that's up a narrow flight of stairs. When you come through Jaffa Gate, you walk past all the merchants. But next time you're in Jerusalem, or as you may remember about Jerusalem, you'll notice that through Jaffa Gate, that street, David Street, as you're walking down, the merchants are all selling Christian paraphernalia and Jewish paraphernalia: candlesticks, Hanukkah menorahs, crosses, pictures of Jesus. Overwhelmingly, these shopkeepers are actually Muslim. But at the end of the day, they just want to make a living, and they know the tourists coming down this way are Jewish and Christian, and so they're selling for them. And there's one place that's actually super emblematic of this. It's a t-shirt stand where one wall of t-shirts are like straight out of a Hasbara magazine. It says, "Don't worry, America, Israel's behind you," or "Who needs Google? My wife is in the Mossad." The IDF t-shirts, the Coca-Cola and Hebrew t-shirts. It's remarkable. And then immediately to the left are the shirts that say "Free Palestine." And there's one shirt that even has the Muslim Brotherhood symbol on it, and another shirt with Yasser Arafat's face across it. And these two stands are side by side, and touching each other. And they're owned by the same guy, and he also sells t-shirts that have different sports teams written in Hebrew as well. Because at the end of the day, all he wants to do is make a living. He's not an ideologue. He just wants to sell. He wants to feed his family. He wants to put his kids to bed at night with full bellies. And that's something else to remember about the old city, that in this place that is so holy and so special and so contentious are just people, just everyday folks who want to make enough to live. And so again, we can't walk through the old city as we would before, but when COVID-19 ends, I urge you, come with me. I'll introduce you to folks and also buy from folks, because these people have just suffered incredible economic loss over the last few months. And one thing's for sure, when you have enough to eat and you're feeling secure in your own finances and in your own ability to provide for your family, you're able to be part of more difficult political conversations and imagine a better future and be part of a partnership with Israelis toward building that better future. So one of the other people that I met as I'm getting to this, sorry for the detour here, through an alleyway into Jerusalem.
It was great. There's no other way. So,
and that's the thing about Jerusalem. It's all these layers upon layers. And so the stories take these different shapes and have this different nuance. So there's this one place, you go up this narrow flight of stairs and you're in this hostel. It's practically windowless. There's one window at the very end of a long hall, communal bathroom, communal showers. And the guy who runs it, his name's Abdallah, and he makes the best chicken soup in the world. That's just what he does. And I joke about being 5'3". Abdallah comes up to my armpit. If we were to slow dance together, which I don't believe we will, his face would be buried right over here. And so one evening he was making his chicken soup, and it had been a long day, and it was a difficult news cycle in Jerusalem. And Rabbi, as you mentioned, these things do come in waves. And this was a period of tension where it didn't feel comfortable to be out in the streets, but I was still there and still living in the old city and in the hostel with Abdallah while he cooked. And the smell of his chicken soup was incredible. And chicken soup, I think, is a birthright. It's you inherit it from your parents, and the best chicken soup in the world, obviously, is the one your mother or your grandmother made. But Abdullah smelled pretty good. He's making it, and he's there, and he's stirring. And then he comes over to me, and he shakes his fist at me, and he says, "You have a problem." I said, "What's my problem?" He said, "You walk in here with your scarf and your tank top and your jewelry and your skinny jeans, and you just trust everybody. That's your problem." And he says, "Here," and he hands me a bowl. He said, "Take your soup. I'm going to tell you a story." I said, "Okay." He says, "You believe what everyone tells you." And he takes out two 10-shekel coins. And he holds each one in one hand, one in another. He says, "One of these coins is real, and one of these is fake. And I could pay you with the fake coin, but you would believe it. You would take that coin, and you would assume it is true because you trust me and you trust the entire world." I said, "Well, I do tend to give people the benefit of the doubt." And I started to get into my whole hashkafat olam, my worldview with him. He says, no, just listen to me. You have to learn to ask questions. And then he holds up the coins again, and he shows me the difference. How one of the coins has the insignia for the state of Israel on it, which means that it's real. The other coin is slightly thicker, but it also feels lighter in my hand, which means that it's fake. And that coin feels rougher around the edges, while the other coin, the real coin, feels smooth. And he tells me that I have to pay more attention to the stories I'm told and the things that I hear and what people try to sell me. Okay. And he says, "I'm telling you this because I learned it from experience the hard way." All right. "Taste your soup," he says. So I taste it. It's delicious. He has a lot of dill in his chicken soup. And he says, for years and years and years, I grew up believing everything people told me. I trusted them. I trusted my parents. I trusted my teachers. I trusted my religious leaders. And I listened to them when they told me that gay people are haram, are taboo, and are evil. And I leaned back a little. I thought, where's he going with this? I come from a very progressive background, and I don't take kindly to hearing slurs against gay people. But I let him finish his sentence. He said, "And I believed it. And I let it sink in through me like water through sand. And I believed it. And I really believed it until one day when I turned 65. It was my 65th birthday. And 65 is a big age. I woke up and I said to myself, maybe I don't hate gay people. Maybe they're not evil. Maybe they're not so taboo and dangerous. Maybe," and he paused, "maybe I'm gay. Yes, I am gay. I decided on my 65th birthday, I am gay. And I live now as a proud and open gay man, and I even go clubbing in Tel Aviv, and I'm part of the LGBTQ center in West Jerusalem, and this is how I live my life. I am gay. Well, I did almost drop my soup, but it was too good, and I didn't spill it. But I looked at him, and I said, Abdallah, you just got through telling me for the last 15 minutes how I should trust nobody. And you showed me how to measure coins to know what's real and what's fake. Why should I believe you? And he shook his finger at me, and he says, Sarah, everything about me is true. Everything. Except for my hair. I dye it for the boys. So that was one of the stories that I loved because it challenged the cat that you hear meowing behind the door is my cat, which leads me to another story that I'll tell you in a moment. But that story challenged so many misconceptions that we have. And it really, that experience with him didn't just go behind a closed door. I mean, it went behind the closed door and it knocked down the wall too. And it was interesting and humbling that even though I was already at a point in my life where I knew that we should ask questions and listen and know when to speak out and know when to shut up, that he even managed to surprise me. And so I am to this day deeply grateful for him for that experience and also for the reminder to expect to be surprised and to expect this radical amazement when you step out of your own comfort zone.
And that is a metaphor. I think, first of all, I just want to say that what a great story and what a great metaphor for Israel, which is before everyone else came on, I was telling Sarah's story about how a recent trip of mine to Israel after many years living there and more trips than I can count, totally changed my view, surprised me when I opened myself up to other viewpoints. And it was frightening, but it was also then very beautiful. And, that is a country that never loses the ability to surprise us and to amaze us. And it's a great metaphor, that story. Why don't you tell us the story about your cat? And then, because I really want to hear it, you've referred to it a few times, and then we'll go to some questions we have in the chat.
Great. So stepping outside of your comfort zone and expecting these kinds of miracles and enjoying the surprise and the revelation was certainly a big part of my book, and part of my experience in Jerusalem and experience in life. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows and eating kanafe and talking about rosemary gardens. There were some pretty horrific things that happened in the old city, and I would be not only naive to say otherwise, but I would be reckless for me not to tell you that the old city is a very complicated place. For all its beauty, there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of pain, and there are at times reasons to really be afraid. And back in 2017, there was a terror attack, and 2 police officers who were guarding the Temple Mount were shot by Palestinian terrorists who had stashed weapons onside the Temple Mount. And so Israel shut down the Temple Mount and did a full weapon search and didn't find anything else and decided to reopen the Temple Mount for Muslim worshipers. But they also said they would do so only with additional security measures in place. And they installed security cameras and metal detectors at all the entrances to the Temple Mount. Now, from my perspective as a Jew who goes through security to get to the Western Wall, that's no harm, no foul. They're just trying to keep everybody safe. That's okay. But from a Palestinian perspective, this was seen as just one more indignity of having to live under Israeli control. And so it was hard for me to wrap my own feelings around all of that. After all, there'd been this terror attack and 2 men were dead. One was a father, one was getting ready to be married, and these guys were just doing their job. But on the other hand, I also understand that from my friends in the Palestinian Muslim community, there were different feelings at play. And around this time then, protests erupted around the Temple Mount. And in some cases, the protests became violent and became riots. But for the most part, they were actually pretty peaceful. And so I went to cover some of the protests as a journalist. And I went out to the walls of the old city by Lionsgate. And I remember sitting there, and it was hot out. It was really hot. It was one of these sort of thick, gray, dusty days in July, which Israel gets every now and then, where the winds from Egypt and Saudi Arabia come through and they carry this dust in the air, and the sun is blank, pitiless in the sky, and it's absolutely miserable. But all these folks were out there protesting, women and men. And I remember seeing some of the guys that I actually knew from various stops along the way in the old city. And they were shouting terrible things. They were shouting, "With blood and fire, we will liberate Aqsa, death to the Jews." And then they also shouted this chant, Khaybar, Khaybar Ya Yahud, which means remembering the battle of Khaybar, Muhammad's battle, where Muhammad's army came and Jews were slaughtered. And I'm looking at these men that I know. They're not particularly friends of mine, but they're people that I've spent time with. And in fact, there's this colloquial expression that if you share a plate of hummus with someone, you can't kill them and they can't kill you. And these were men that I had shared hummus with. And I look at them and they look at me and they see me and I see them and they know that I see them, and they're continuing to say this. And I realize it isn't about me, Sarah, the Jew, the Israeli, the journalist. It's about their bigger anger. But in that moment, that didn't matter. I was hurt. I was angry. I was sad. I was frustrated. I felt heartbroken. One of my reasons for wanting to live in each of the four quarters of the old city is that here in the hottest piece of spiritual real estate in the world, where we're all in love with the same entity and the same God, just expressed in different ways, we pass each other and we don't see each other, except during moments of tension when we collide with each other, when we're angry, when we are afraid. And one of the things I wanted to see if I could overcome was that, if there was a way to build bridges between different communities. And in that moment, while I'm by Lion's Gate and I see these men and they see me, I think, that's it, I'm done. What's the point? There is no hope. We can't build these bridges. We're burning these bridges. But I decided, instead of turning back and leaving the old city, and I was close to doing that, I decided to stay a little longer. Turns out I'm pretty stubborn, and I'm a stubborn optimist. And I thought maybe there's still hope. But I was still crushed. And I remember a few days later, it was a Sunday, and I'm walking once again through Lion's Gate. I'm going up Via della Rosa. This is the street where Christians believe that Jesus walked on his way to being crucified. And as I get to the area between the 6th and 7th station, so midway between Lion's Gate and Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I hear shouting and I hear clanging and I hear banging. Now, most people would turn around and run away from that kind of sound, but I'm a journalist and a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and so I go toward the sound. What do I see? I see these men who are sweating. Some of them are smoking cigarettes, and several of them have hammers, and one guy has an axe in his hand, and they're banging on a pipe. I don't know what they're doing, but a friend of mine is over there. His name's Omar, and I turned to Omar and I said, "Omar, shuhada, like, what is this? What's going on?" And he said, "Sarah, you will not believe it." I said, "Try me." And he said, "You won't believe it." I said, No, come on, tell me. He said, "These men are trying to rescue a kitten. There's a kitten caught inside the pipe." And these men with their axes, sweating and smoking and shouting, are banging on this pipe. And one of the men I recognize from the demonstration. He was the one, waving his fist in the air and shouting, "With blood and fire will liberate Aqsa, death to the Jews." But he has tears in his eyes, and he is banging on that pipe with all his might with his hammer. And meanwhile, there's this whole assemblage of people. There's a priest, there's an imam, there's a rabbi, there's a nun. And no, it's not the beginning of a joke. It's really a beginning of a rescue operation to get this kitten out of the pipe. There are kids from the different communities, Jewish kids, Arab kids, there's pilgrims. There's this one guy with a guitar and he's singing something in Spanish about Jesus and about a cat. My Spanish isn't very good, but I know, I can recognize the word Jesus in Spanish and gato's cat in Spanish. And so something's going on. And all these folks are there. And there's just this fervent desire to get that kitten out. And finally, the guy from the protest hits the pipe with a mighty blow, and it breaks, and out comes this tiny kitten that is no bigger than the palm of my hand, even smaller, and its ears are folded over and its eyes are still closed. And the man from the protest, this man who was so angry just 2 days before and saying such vile things picks up this kitten with such gentleness, and he's holding it like it's this, like it's a sacred offering. And he looks around and he says, what do we do? We can't just leave the kitten here. The kitten will die. And so we convene a meeting. We try to figure out what to do. The kitten's too young to drink. She won't drink water. He won't drink milk. There's no mother cat in sight. But then I remember that in the Jewish quarter, there's a woman named Tova, the cat lady. That's her semi-official name. And she has that name because she has taken it as a sacred holy mission to rescue the cats of the old city. So when the British came, shortly after World War I, they realized that Jerusalem was overrun with rats and mice. And so the British did what British do, and they tried to solve the problem. And they solved the problem by bringing in cats. So the cats took care of the mice, but the problem is now Jerusalem's overrun with cats. God said, be fruitful and multiply, and the cats took that very seriously. So Tova has taken it as her holy work to rescue the cats of the old city. She sets traps late at night, and she brings them to the veterinary clinics nearby, and she has them spayed and neutered and vaccinated and dewormed, and if they're sick, she takes care of them and nurses them back to health. And so I call her up. She answers the phone. She doesn't know me from, a hole in the wall. She said, hello. And I said, hi, my name's Sarah. I'm calling from the Muslim quarter. We just rescued a kitten. Well, she said, I don't need your life story. What do you want from me? I think Tova's originally from Brooklyn. I said, well, we don't know what to do with the kitten. The kitten's really young. Well, it's not rocket science, she says. You got to feed the kitten. And I said, well, I know we have to feed the kitten, but the kitten's too young to eat. Well, get an eyedropper, Tova says. Get an eyedropper and feed the kitten every 2 hours. Now, I have 2 children. I've done the whole breastfeeding around the clock and bottle feeding around the clock extravaganza. I don't want to do that with a kitten. And also my life is so back and forth in different places that it's not possible. And I tell her that. And she said, all right, whatever. I don't need your life story. Bring me the kitten. I'll take care of the kitten. And so I turned to the men in the Muslim quarter and I said, hey, there's this woman in the Jewish quarter who will take the cat. And one of the guys says, oh, you mean Tova, the cat lady? I said, yes. And they said, great. And suddenly we were walking down Via Della Rosa, holding this kitten. And then we hook a right turn onto Al-Wad Street, Haggai Street, the street that has 2 names that runs back and forth between Damascus Gate and the Western Wall that I read to you about earlier. And we're all there, the kids from the different communities, the priest, the imam, the rabbi, the nuns, the tourists, the pilgrim, the guy with the guitar who's playing something more jolly and upbeat, border police, and soldiers have now joined us, and more people have come, because whenever you see a kitten, it's like the cutest thing in the world, and everyone's just glommed onto this kitten. And we go into the Jewish quarter, and we meet Tova in the square in the Jewish quarter. She's also an emergency EMT and volunteer, and so she was wearing her EMT outfit because she was late to her post. And to this day, that kitten is living in the Jewish quarter. And Tova knows that this kitten, during this time of incredible tension, incredible fear and anger between our communities, this kitten was rescued by Muslim Palestinians. And the Muslim Palestinian guys who rescued this kitten knows that in this period of incredible tension, fear, frustration, anxiety, this kitten was cared for by a woman in the Jewish quarter. And people think I make up this story when I tell it to them, but every time I walk in the old city, and when you come and visit me and we walk in the old city, I can almost promise you that someone is going to come up to me and say, how's the cat doing? Because that happens every time I'm in the old city. And every time someone asks me, how's the cat? I give the same answer. And that answer is, thank God, the cat is all right. And I'm going to be giving that answer whether it's a week from now or 40 years from now, because that cat has to be all right. Because that cat represents something. It represents that possibility that even in the middle of such difficulty and such darkness and such fear of one another, that we're able to transcend and work together to save one of God's creatures, as we all are too, one of God's creatures. And that story is one of my favorites from the Old City, and there are so many others like it and so many opportunities to have those kinds of stories. But I love sharing that story, so thank you for letting me share.
Thank you for sharing it. It's beautiful, and it answered One of our questions, I think, Gail, who sends her love to you and your family, had asked about, can you tell us something, a word of hope, something, we all need something good, and you're better at that than most, she says. Can you tell us something to give us hope? I think that was it. I mean, that was beautiful. Thank you. There was one other question. We have just a couple minutes, but just coming back to the situation with the coronavirus, a question about, the Arab community, and if they had been as compliant and as careful. A lot of the Arabs, certainly in Jerusalem and really all over the country in small villages, live very closely together.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, so one theory is, Arab men don't want to admit they're sick because there's a machismo there, and so they might not be getting the help they need. And another narrative that says it's just the circumstances in which Arabs are living are very conducive to the spread of disease because they're so close together. And so what's your perspective as far as how the compliance in those communities have been, and if there has been more spread in those communities, or if it's affected differently, why that might be?
So I can speak to this on a personal level. So my partner is not Jewish. He is Arab. He's actually an East Jerusalemite Christian Palestinian. I'm an American Israeli Zionist Jew. So that's another long conversation for another time about the complexities
your next
there.
book.
And we have a lot of interesting conversations because we're both very true to our own identities. But I've spent a lot of time with his family in a Catholic compound on Mount of Olives, literally behind my shoulder on that side in the picture, in my screen picture. And so I can tell you about their community. Their community has been more compliant than the moshav where I live or the kibbutz where my ex-husband lives. Everybody walks around wearing masks. They were socially distancing themselves even before the directives were in place. We were not allowed to visit them even before there was the lockdown, and government told us we're not allowed to visit, but they asked us not to come. I've seen them wearing masks inside the house, even after the restrictions have lifted and we're allowed to be together. And when they're sick, whether it's an infected toenail, sorry for the visual, or a stomach virus or something else going on, they will go to the doctor if it's something that they feel they can't treat at home. So there's no fear about admitting that there's any medical weakness or the like. So that's what I've noticed within that community. Within the folks I know in the Muslim community have been just as compliant. I take taxis a fair amount. I wasn't during the 2 months of lockdown, and it's only been more recently that I've started going back into taxis, but every single driver has a mask. This also includes Jewish drivers too, but every Muslim East Jerusalemite driver or driver from Ramla, which is another city that is mixed Jewish and Arab, but every Arab driver from Ramla has been wearing masks. There has been, it's actually quite moving. I know that some people were concerned that there might be some ways of trying to exploit anxiety around the virus for, in terms of perpetuating violence. There's been none of that. And folks have been remarkably supportive and kind and respectful of the rules. I've seen in my own experience with both Muslim and Christian community, absolutely no rule breaking. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's just, but from my own, anecdotal experiences, there's been tremendous compliance and concern. And in fact, in the West Bank, Bethlehem was cordoned off, was quarantined even before cities in Israel were under lockdown, because there was a case where Greek tourists came and got somebody sick, and then they just put the city, Bethlehem and Beit Jala, on immediate lockdown. And folks were told they could buy groceries, but then even many of the stores were shut down. So it was even more strict than what we were seeing in Israel. And their cases have stayed low. Now, the challenge also, there is a challenge, and that is testing has been more difficult in East Jerusalem. And so, the Palestinian Authority offered tests in East Jerusalem, but Israel turned them away. And now there's tensions between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, where Palestinian Authority has actually ceased security connection with Israel, which is a disaster for them and also not so great for us. And so there may be fewer testing sites available for East Jerusalemites. So there may be higher instances that we just don't know about. But from everything I've seen, there's been great compliance and also concern for one another.
Thank you. That's a great perspective to have. Two things I would say. One, on this trip a couple of years ago, I actually had the opportunity to go to Bethlehem for the first time, and what a remarkable place! But also very tightly packed together. People reminds a lot of the old city. People very close together. The color of the stone is different, but the living style is very similar. If I could ask you a quick follow-up.
Sure.
On that, and real quick, because I know we have to wrap up. Just in America, the hope started out as we're all going to be affected by this virus the same way, and therefore it's going to be a great equalizer. And what has happened, literally now on the streets, we're seeing the effects of it, I think, at least it's related, was that the virus, it turned out, hit minority communities and poor communities so much harder because of the disparity in access to healthcare and because of the various other issues, including communication and where people get their news from, as you had mentioned with the Haredim early in our conversation. So do you think that from this virus in Israel, which also affected everyone the same, but maybe also a little different, as you mentioned, and for those of you on the call, I also got to spend some time in East Jerusalem, which I had not before. There's all kinds of problems with access to civic services in East Jerusalem, whether it's post offices or places to pay your parking tickets, or apparently access to tests. So the question is, do you have hope, having the country having gone through all this, that there's going to be bridges built from this, or is this going to end up divisive down the line, where this is really going to highlight the disparity, which it seems is the direction that the United States is going, which maybe gives us the opportunity to heal those wounds after they become more apparent. But is there something parallel going on in Israel?
It's a great question. Right now, also. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Israel is also dealing with something pretty upsetting that happened on Saturday, last Saturday. And so it's been 8 days. A young autistic Palestinian man was on his way to a special needs school in the old city by Lionsgate, where I described watching the protesters. And he was stopped by the police because he was holding what appeared to be a suspicious object in his hand. And it turns out that suspicious object was his phone. And he was holding his phone because his mom had asked him to always hold his phone in case he got scared and needed to call her. And the police asked him to stop. He didn't understand the instructions. He ran, and his caretaker from the school tried to intervene. And she told the police, he's disabled. He doesn't know what you're saying. And the young man said, I'm with her. But the police continued to shoot him. And we don't know we haven't seen the footage. It's a very upsetting chapter in our history right now that we're going through and dealing with, and that has brought out some more of the frustrations and the differences and the anxieties and the rage of Palestinians, especially East Jerusalemite Palestinians, and also now Jewish Israeli folks are pretty upset too and want to see the footage to understand more about what's going on as we start to face our own challenges. Now, obviously, there's different contexts here. The conflict is always a context, and there are terror attacks, and sometimes a suspicious object is in fact a suspicious object and a weapon. And so all of this has called into question many things as Israel deals with that, with the backdrop of the coronavirus. And so it would be remiss if I didn't mention that. But what I also want to mention, as Israel is looking at our own internalized issues of prejudice and bigotry and racism, is that we've also overwhelmingly seen, as I mentioned before, that so many of our healthcare workers are Arab, the pharmacists, the nurses, the doctors. And so this has really also been a very moving and bright moment in this chapter too, as we're realizing that our fates are intertwined and that this is what shared society really is. That if our grandmother goes into the hospital, there's a very odds are that she will be treated by an Arab doctor. What also is remarkable is last year there was a Pew survey here in Israel, and Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel were asked, how do you identify? And overwhelmingly, folks identified as Palestinian citizens of Israel, or they identified as Arab. And now that survey, the question was asked again, and I think it was 60% of the folks asked said that they identify as Israeli. And so this new idea of Israel, what it means to be Israeli, is starting to emerge out of all of this, and that incorporates both the Muslim and the Christian community in with the Jewish community, that we're in the pangs of birth of this new identity. Lucy Aharish is a journalist. She's Muslim. She's married to a Jewish Israeli who's actually an actor from the TV series Fauda, from Avi's series, and she's worth following on Facebook and reading her commentary, because she also represents this changing tide of folks who are from minority community in Israel who are saying, yes, but we're Israeli. We want you to treat us as Israeli. And it's very moving to see. And that's something that we are in the throes of struggling with right now. We are not having the kind of reaction that you're having in the US. I wish more people, I'm going to get a little political here. I wish more people were out peacefully protesting the death of this young man. I wish but there is beginning to be a sense of folks waking up to realize that we have to really tackle our own problems. And in fact, maybe we're inspired in some ways by the protests across America, especially in the Jewish community, people we identify with who are standing up for the memory of George Floyd and standing up to institutionalized prejudice in the country. And I'm hoping that there can be ways that our communities can work together to support one another in that as we move towards a better future.
Amen. Thank you. Well, Sarah, I want to thank you for being with us. Again, I want to thank Holly and the World Jewry Committee at Westchester Jewry Center for setting this up. It was beautiful. It was real. It was engaging. I expect, just as I expected when I knew we were going to have the opportunity to sit down with you. So thank you for being here with us. And for you, we'll wish you a good evening. Sarah, could you say the name of that journalist again?
Oh, sure. Lucy Aharish. Let me write her name. Lucy
Aharish, so we can follow up if we want to. And Holly was showing you the book. I was about to do the same. Jerusalem Drawn and Quartered is Sarah Tuttle-Singer's book, full of these kinds of stories, a perspective on Jerusalem most of us don't get, and that is really, really worthwhile. So thank you all for being with us, and thank you especially Sarah, and I wish you all a beautiful Sunday, and to you a beautiful Sunday night.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Holly, thank you for facilitating this, and thanks to everyone who's listening. It's an honor to meet you this way. I'm going to leave my email here. You can be in touch with me, and I'm leaving my phone number too if you're on WhatsApp and you have more questions, etc. And so there's my contact information, and please feel free to use it, especially if you have children or grandchildren or brothers or sisters or family in Israel and you want a semi-responsible adult to be aware and in the picture. So you can use me as any resource. I'm here to help you. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you. You're so kind. Thank you.
Thanks for a wonderful program.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that. Thank you.
All right.
Bye,
Have a good
everybody.
day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
You guys. Lisa, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Donna. Good to see you, Donna. Hi, Lisa.